All right, our Yahweh Army followers, I'm here with Miss Nissa, and I'm sure a lot of you are curious after our previous video about her organization to hear her testimony. So I'm sitting here with her today, and we are going to get the opportunity to hear Miss Nissa's testimony. Just go ahead and start from the beginning, really.
Okay. I share it all the time. I'll try to give the briefer version of it so that you'll get an idea of, where my life came from. But it really started, I guess I have to go back to birth because I wasn't raised by my parents. I was raised by my grandparents, and, they provided such a safe home to where I didn't understand that I was parentless, per se, if that makes sense. Because they were so safe. They were in the military. They were Christians. So, we just had a home. And then when I was about 9 years old, my mom contacted them, and my mom wanted us to come live with them live with her for the first time. And my grandmother never wanted to keep us out of her life. We knew of her, we just didn't know her well. And so we went and lived with her. I was 9 years old at the time. We moved to Germany. While I was in Germany, I was gang raped by 4 grown men. So in that moment, my life,
were you when that happened?
9 years old. Okay. 9 years old. My life just really flipped upside down because I had never been exposed to any violence. I had never been exposed to any criminal activities, nothing. I had always just been in this safe place. So after the rape occurred, I was walking up a hill. The way that Germany was, it was like down in a hill, and we were up on the army base. But I was walking up the hill, and I just was crying and didn't know what to do, didn't know who to talk to, didn't know anything. I was just a 9-year-old little girl. But when I got back to the house, and I don't mean to be graphic, but this is reality, but I had blood leaking down my legs. And my stepfather, he said, "Oh, if you're old enough to bleed, you're old enough to breed." And he put rubber gloves on, and he took me into a room, and he molested me. And so I went from a gang rape to molested by my stepfather, all in 24 hours. So mentally, as a child at that time, I just felt like my life, I didn't even know why life existed at this point. I remember growing up in church and my grandmother and them talking about God, but that was the day and the moment that I said God must not be real, because that's not the God that my grandparents introduced me to in my life.
Right.
So I went on this journey of believing that God was not real. And that went on, the molestation with my stepdad and the physical violence with my stepdad went on for about 2 years. In that moment, I thought my mom knew. So I hated her guts. I couldn't stand her. I didn't want anything to do with her. I felt like she knew, but she just wasn't saying anything. And my grandmother, she would call, and she could tell that we were very distant. So she told my mom, she said, "I don't know what's happened to your daughter, but something has happened to your daughter, and I need her to come home." And so my mom put me and my sister back on the plane the next day, technically. So by this time, I was 10 years old, and after that happened, when I was in Germany, before I came back to the United States, I started learning how to, be sexually promiscuous with men, and things like that. And I started drinking when I was 10 years old and started smoking weed when I was 10 years old. So by the time I came back to the United States, I already had a little addiction issue going on. It wasn't major yet, but I did, have one going on. And I was very violent. I was fighting people for no reason, trying to get all of that anger out. So I was very, very, very violent with people. So I came back to the United States, and my grandmother really, she tried so hard to get her little girl back. She did everything in her power, but I just wasn't coming back. At this point, I didn't want to hear about God. I didn't care about God. So I would sneak and find ways to steal liquor from the liquor store. I met a friend, and I won't disclose her name, but I met a friend who her mother taught her how to trick and make money off of having sex with older grown men. And so I remember her mother saying, you have a treasure box between your legs. If you're going to use it, get paid to use it. So at 12 years old, I started my first prostitution gig. I didn't street walk. It was always high dollar, big time people. It was lawyers, doctors. But I also wanted, and I always share this in my testimony because it changed my mentality towards even further against God. I was on a playground at school playing, because mind you, I'm only 12 years old, and the associate pastor at the church across the street called me over and invited me into the church and paid me to have sex with him in the baptistry. And so that was my first time turning a trick without knowing what I was doing with this pastor or whatnot. And so from age 12 to 30, I was prostituted, but it was always high class in dollars. Now in this day and age, they would have called it trafficking. There wasn't trafficking in that time. But, according to the law now, anything under the age of 18 is trafficking, because you don't have the carnal knowledge to consent to that type of behavior. And plus, I was groomed. I didn't have a pimp, but I did have a woman teach me how to make money doing what I did. So I started the prostitution, which is when I got involved with a lot of drugs and drug dealers. So I started a life of drug trafficking. I didn't know how to make any money legally. I would drug traffic across borders, different cities, different states. And it's funny because I didn't get my first arrest or my first charge until I was probably about 16 years old. So for years, I did a lot of stuff undercover and no one ever knew. They just saw me as this sweet little innocent girl that wanted to, live a street life. But nobody knew. Nobody knew I was doing the prostitution. Nobody knew I was doing the drug trafficking. But then when I was 16, everything kind of came out. It spiraled out of control. I got invited to a football party at NSU in Natchitoches, Louisiana. And I actually was gang raped by the football team. So I went there under the precept that I was going for a party. But when I was in there, they turned the lights off, and me and my two friends, they literally had their way with us. And then they threw us out on the street, butt naked. None of us had clothes on. They had poured urine on us. They had literally, we was just in a very bad state. So I was walking down Kaiser Avenue, and I ran into a police officer, and he was like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "No, I need help. I've just been sexually assaulted by the NSU football team." And he was like, "Well, that's because you're out here and you're always in the streets and you're always in trouble." So he started blaming me. So he put me in the back of his cop car, and he told me he was taking me to the hospital. But he ended up going down an old country dirt road, and he raped me in the back of his cop car. Then had enough nerve to take and drop me off at the emergency room and filed the report that I had been assaulted by the NSU football team. But not once did he mention any of his criminal mischief and his criminal behavior. After I left the hospital, I did tell my grandfather about the rape of the police officer. I was told by the hospital that I would never have children, that the rape was so brutal that my insides was completely dysfunctioned and I would never have any children, anything like that. So by this time I had lost all numbness to life. I didn't want to live anymore. I tried to commit suicide that night.
And how old are you at this point?
16
okay.
years old. My first suicide attempt, I overdosed on pills and alcohol, and I did it on purpose. I drank beyond the limit of normal consumption because I wanted to die of poisoning. I woke up in the hospital with charcoal. They made me drink charcoal, and I had tubes and stuff stuffed down my throat. The doctors told my grandmother, it should have been successful. There's no reason, no way she should have survived this. She should be dead. With the consumption in her body, she should be dead. And then I left there. They had me psychiatrically evaluated. The psychiatrist said, "Nothing's wrong with her." Everybody's like, "How is nothing wrong with her? What do you mean? This girl is crazy." But the doctor's like, "There's nothing wrong with her. She's had some trauma, there's nothing wrong with her." So I left from there, and I just continued living that lifestyle. I tried multiple other suicide attempts. I started adding to the clientele. But I was just numb. I was doing hallucinogens. I was doing a lot of acid, ecstasy, smoking weed, drinking morning, noon to night. I couldn't even function without being on some form of substance. So I was at the end of my 16 year, right before my 17th birthday, I was told I was pregnant. And I'm like, well, I can't be pregnant because the doctor said I'll never have children. Right. And so I miscarried. Well, when I miscarried, the doctor said you'll never be able, can get pregnant, but you'll never be able to have a full-term pregnancy, and you'll never have a living child. So at that point, I was like, well, I don't care how I live. So I really got out there. I started doing adult videos online, and I just didn't care about my appearance. I didn't care about my character. I didn't care about what people thought about me. I was going to live this life because at this point I was addicted to money as well. Right. I had so much money as a young kid. It's just, my mind was blown. I tell people all the time, some kids are sitting around thinking about their future. I was trying to come up with a porn name, and I was going to be a porn star. That was my mindset, because I didn't love myself. I didn't love life, and I did not believe that God existed at this point. And then I was 4 to 19 years old, or 18 years old. A friend of mine came to me, and she said, Nissa, she said, I think I'm pregnant. I'm about to have 2 kids. I can't have 2 kids at our age. And I'm like, well, I can't have children, so I'll go with you, and take a pregnancy test. So I took her to my grandmother's pregnancy test, free pregnancy clinic that she volunteers at, because there's no way I'm pregnant, and they know I'm out there in the street, so they knew I was sexually active. Well, they come back and tell me I'm pregnant. I'm like, oh, well, it's not going to last long. She's not going to survive. It's no big deal. And literally, she's standing here today. She's 28 years old. So I had a full-term pregnancy. At 18. Okay. And that's actually what got me off drugs. I've been clean off of drugs now for 28 years. She's 28 years old. And that came from me saying that I didn't want to be like my mother. I felt like my mother abandoned us because of drug use and men and all of these other things. And I had always said, if I have a child, I don't care if I raise her poorly, I don't care what I drag her through, I don't want to be an addict. I didn't want her to suffer from the drugs. Right. But I didn't give up liquor. I still was an alcoholic. So many nights my daughter would clean me up out of my vomit and have to put me to bed. And so many nights I neglected her because I was in the clubs and I was chasing, alcohol. Now I did still smoke weed. I was still addicted to weed, but I had got off the acid and the hallucinogens, the pills. Right. So I still did the prostitution because I didn't even know how to flip a burger. I didn't know how to work at McDonald's. I didn't know how to do anything. So I still continued to do the prostitution, but I just never did it in the home with them. That's one thing I drew a line. I would never bring the men in the home. And then here we are, 7 suicide attempts. 2007 was my final suicide attempt. I got to the age of 30. I didn't think I would live to be an adult. I got to the age of 30, and I was in Dallas, Texas, and I had a situation to where some people were after me. And something told me to pack up my car, get on the highway, and just find a new location. I was like, well, I don't know where I'm going, but that's what I'm going to do. So I packed up my car, all of my children, all of my kids. I had 3 living children at this time, but I've lost 5. So I had 5 miscarriages and 3 full living children. None of them with fathers in their lives because I was making, of course, some very stupid decisions. Right. But at 30 years old, I'm getting in the car, I'm packing them up. I'm on the highway, and I get a phone call from my aunt who I hadn't talked to in a very long time. And out of the blue, she was like, well, are you anywhere near Louisiana? Where are you at? And I'm like, well, how did you get in touch with me? She was like, well, someone saw you in Texas, an old childhood friend of my grandmother's. And she said she saw you in Walmart, so she started calling us to tell us that she found you. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, wow, okay, no problem. So I told her, I said, well, I don't know where I'm at. I'm on an interstate, but as soon as I find out where I'm at, if I can get to Louisiana, I'll go that way. Literally 30 minutes later, I saw the Louisiana signs. I'm like, Lord, I didn't even know I was headed to Louisiana. So we get to Louisiana, and she was like, you can stay here, but you have to promise that you won't go out. Like, don't go to no clubs, don't drink nothing. Get you a good night rest. Let the children get something to eat. Let them have a good night's rest, and just rest tonight, and we'll talk tomorrow. I'm like, oh, okay, no problem. Well, that night I had peeped in at my children, and I saw that they were so comfortable. You know, they were sleeping in a bed. It was a nice house. My aunt and uncle were financially stable, and that's all I ever wanted. All I ever wanted was for them to have a good life. And so I had wrote a suicide letter that night, and I said, this is what my kids deserve. I said, I know people say suicide is selfish, but how can it be selfish when I'm leaving them to a good home? Right. How am I only thinking about myself when I'm giving them a financial stability? They won't have to worry about me. I don't even know how I can provide for them anymore because I've just thrown away my whole life to start over. So I left the letter, and I went and bought a bottle of Vicodin. When I bought the bottle of Vicodin, it was my first night meeting the man. I never met him before, but you can find drugs anywhere. If you can't find nothing else, you can find drugs. And so I told him, I said, look, I want 30. And he was like, oh, you sound like you really about to party. I said, I'm about to do something all right. And he said, well, let me give you 6 extra on the house. I said, okay, no problem. I know how drugs go. I used to sell drugs. So that was his way of getting more clientele in. Let me do her a favor. Because at this point, he's thinking I'm an addict or something.
Right. You'll be back.
I'll be back. And so that was his mind frame. And so I took them 36 Vicodins, and I went on LSU Lake, and I took all 36 pills. And I sat there by LSU Lake where my heart stopped beating, and I literally passed out and became completely dead at LSU Lake. They had a man that was jogging. He saw my truck sitting there. He knocks on the window. I didn't respond. He calls the ambulance. I go to the hospital. They got me on the table. They're trying to resuscitate me. They got all the little machines. They're pumping my chest, all of this stuff. Nothing. And I'm telling you, they put the cover over my head. They was about to call. The only person I had listed as a next of kin was my daughter, who was 12 at the time. Literally, we're about to call a 12-year-old child to tell her, come identify your mama's body. And all of a sudden, I heard a voice that said, I raised Lazarus from the dead. I'm like, who are you? Like, I don't know who you are. And he said, I raised Lazarus from the dead. He said, you known me as a child, but you have not known me. He said, I am God. I'm the one that sent my son, Jesus Christ, down the cross for your sins. Now, mind you, I'm dead, but I'm remembering this conversation. I'm remembering that he and I, I'm hearing this voice. And he was like, I'll give you a chance if you'll believe in my son. And, most people think, of course, you're going to say, yeah, but there's people in this life today that will still say, no, I don't believe in you. Right. But because I remembered him as a child, I said, I believe in you. I'll give this a chance to believe in your son. So literally, immediately, my heart started beating. The doctors, I sat up on the table, and I'm like, why is this cover over my head? I used to suffer with PTSD, like, don't put anything over my face. It was like somebody was going to try to kill me. So I sit up on the table, and the doctors are like, that's impossible. I wasn't hooked up to no machines. Nothing was helping me breathe. The machines was turned off. I was literally said to be dead. I sit up, and when I sit up, and the doctors are looking like, that's impossible. And I said, I just heard God say he raised Lazarus from the dead, and he gave me another chance. The emergency room doctor got on his knees and gave his life to Christ in that moment. I didn't say nothing. All he saw was that moment. And so when I went when I got out of the hospital, I was back in my aunt's house. My aunt said, you can live here with one condition. I said, what's the one condition? You have to go to church. I said, I am not. Nobody is forcing me to go to church at 30 years old. She was like, that's the only way you can live here. And then my uncle was like, what else are you going to do, Nissa? You don't know how to work. You don't have a job. You have these 3 kids. You need to think about your children. If you ain't going to do this for yourself, do it for your children. And so I went to church, and mind y'all, this was a church. They didn't barely believe in raising their hands. They didn't believe in speaking in tongues. It was a Christmas service, so they're preaching about, I don't even think they preached about the full birth of Jesus Christ. They were doing more of a kid service. And I'm in the middle, and it's a mega church, like 2,500 people at service this day. And here's me by myself sitting in this church. They're not even doing a message on repentance. And I just start weeping. And I heard the Lord say, Nissa, I called you to purity. And I'm like, that's impossible. How can you call someone to purity when all they know is prostitution, addiction? That's all they know. How did you call me to purity? And he said, if you trust me, I'll show you. And I said, man, how am I going to do this? I can't even, I was at a point in my life to where I couldn't even wake up in the morning and not drink, because if I didn't drink, I was being tormented.
Right.
Like I could not function without some form of substance in my system. And so I started weeping, but I wasn't weeping because of salvation. I was weeping because I was scared of salvation.
Yeah.
I didn't know what it looked like. I didn't know how it was supposed to look. I didn't know nothing. I didn't know what God was going to do. So they don't even do an altar call at this church. But the Lord told me, go to the altar, kneel down, and give your life to me. So that's what I did. I went to the altar, kneeled down, started praying. And it was funny because out of everybody in this mega church, the only person that came to the altar behind me was my aunt. She put her hand on my back and she prayed. So when I left the church that day, I said, God, I don't know what this looks like, but I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you this chance. And so funny thing is, a lot of people say that they've never had withdrawals from alcohol, but I did. The first 4 or 5 days, I would tremble and I would shake. It wasn't the same as an addiction to drugs. I've came off of drugs. I knew what that felt like, but it still felt like my body was being cleansed and purged out from something. And I would have extreme headaches. And I said, whoever said that you don't have withdrawals from coming off alcohol is a liar, because I was like a nervous wreck. But that's when someone told me that it's not that you don't have withdrawals, but most people who come off alcohol still smoke cigarettes or drink a lot of coffee. I wasn't doing none of that. Right. I was just coming off of, a substance. But after about 3 or 4 days, I was completely to a normal state. And so from that moment forward, I began reading my Bible every day, learned how to fast, learned how to pray. And then I started walking the life of Christ. That was December 7th, 2007. So fast forward, here we are. And like I said, this is a short version. There's so much to the testimony. And I do share with people. I was at a place, by the time I gave my life to Christ, I wasn't no good for nobody. I had been with hundreds of men. I done had so many AIDS accidents where people was calling saying, oh, I've got AIDS. And I'm like, but I just slept with you. I had been raped over 28 times in my life. I was raped by one of my husbands multiple times. He was a crack addict. And so there's more to it, but I like to give the main basis of it for people to understand that the whole purpose of those 20 years of prostitution, the 20 years of addiction, came from the pain of being raped and molested at 9 years old. Everything that happened in them 20 years happened because I became a product of my environment. It wasn't my fault that I got raped, but because I didn't have any self-esteem, I was insecure. I felt like this was the only way of life. That I was always putting myself in scenarios that could then turn into rape. Even with my second husband, he, for 6 hours, he held me hostage in the house and beat me naked in front of my children. My children were crying and screaming. Beat me to a pulp. He poured hot sauce in my eyes, drugged me out the shower, put a gun to my head, pulled the trigger, but thankfully the gun did not go off. So all of these things was a product of my environment, because that's the lifestyle that I felt like was my life, because that's what was given to me when I got raped at 9 years old. So when you become a product of your environment, those things begin to happen in your life, not because it's your fault, but that's what you feel like is your normal. Yeah. So for me, being raped was normal. For me, domestic violence was normal. For me, suicide was normal. Self-mutilation was normal. These things were my normal because that was the direction of life that I took after being sexually assaulted.
And now that you know God, isn't it awesome to look back and see how many times His hand was all over your life?
Yes, Lord.
Through everything.
Yes, and that's what I was about to say. I fast forwarded to the God part because that's where your true victory comes from. Your true victory comes when you can give your life to Christ and consistently walk. You know, I walked 17 years total celibacy from being a prostitute. Total celibacy. Not TMI, but, you know, no self-gratification, no anything. Total celibacy for 17 years until the Lord brought me out and ended up giving me a husband. And I didn't want it, but that's what He had for my life. And, you know, one of the things He told me when I asked Him, I said, well, Lord, you know, I didn't want to be married. Why did you do this? And He said, I wanted to give you a gift. I wanted you to learn. I've never been in love before. I've never had a real relationship. I've never had a true understanding of what it meant to be loved by a person. But God sees that as beautiful. He sees love as beautiful. He sees marriage as beautiful. And He told me that recently. He was like, that's my gift. That was a gift that I've given you because you deserve to be loved by someone.
Right.
You never know what love is. And I want you to understand what love is in a person. And so that was a gift to me. And so, yes, you're right. When I look back now and I look at how many bullets I dodged, how many stab wounds I overcame, how many aid opportunities I had, the 7 suicide attempts, the multiple overdoses. I overdosed so many times. And I look back and I'm like, man, God, I even repented to Him one time for saying He wasn't real. I said, Lord, I am. And He knew why I said He wasn't real. And He wasn't mad at me for it. He understood why I said He wasn't real. But I felt like I needed to repent and say, God, I'm so sorry for saying you weren't real. Because you were real the whole time. I just couldn't see you past my pain.
Right.
You know, and so here I am, 2025, January 1st, walking with the Lord for 17 years. I've never backslid back into addiction. That's a testimony. That's a miracle. I never went back into any form of sexual behavior. Never went back into prostitution. When I first got saved, you know, I had a lot of cleaning up to do with my children. My children hated me. I was a horrible mother. I loved them, but it was the love I knew.
Right.
And you only can give love to someone what you know. So I didn't understand that my love was abusive. I didn't understand my love was neglect. My love was, you know, so I felt like I loved them. And I would get so mad when they would say, you're the worst mother. I hate you. And I'm like, but I've given you this. Like, I'm looking at it like, I never left you. I never walked out of your life. I'm giving you. And then it took me getting saved for the Lord to be like, you gave them a love that you knew. And your love was toxic. You was abusive. You was corrupt. You was wicked. You were evil. So that was the love that you gave them. Not that I didn't love them, but I didn't know the love that I know now. So I wasn't able to give them the love that I know now. So really my testimony hasn't really been the struggle of getting off of addiction and stuff like that. Is cleaning up the mess that I made with my children. Because I want my children to know who God is. I don't want them to go down the same path that I went down. And I didn't want them to suffer the same things that I suffered. And so as of today, you know, I'm very thankful and proud that, you know, it wasn't an easy healing process that I went through, because there were times that I'm like, but God, why do I have to forgive? You know, that was my biggest thing. Yeah. When I started walking the process out with Him, and He was like, I need you to forgive those 4 men that raped you when you were 9. I'm like, why? Do they deserve that? I
think forgiveness is the hardest thing that God ever calls us to do.
Yes, it is very hard, because what happened to you is a reality. And what He ended up showing me along the way is like with my mom. My mom was probably the hardest person in my life to forgive. I never understood why she did what she did. I never understood why she excused what she did, because she used to always say I didn't have a maternal bone in my body. I'm like, but if God made you a mother, right. He gave you the instinct to be a mother. You chose not to be a mother. And so I had that hard conversation with her. And I told her how it made me feel with her saying that. And then the Lord said, now it's time for you to forgive her. And so When I forgave her and was able to actually talk to her about some things, that's when I learned that no, she didn't know about the gang rape when I was 9. She did confess to not being a mother. She was able to open up with her own transgressions per se, and we were able to work it out to where now she lives with me and she's part of my ministry. But forgiveness was the hardest part, but now forgiveness has become the easiest part. Yeah. Because forgiveness, I've learned, that's what made me free. When I began to forgive the rapes, when I began to forgive the people that walked out on my life, or the domestic violence abusers. But then when I forgave myself, I made horrible decisions, horrible mistakes. I hurt people along the way. I wasn't a perfect person. And so the forgiveness really has been the key to walking, the life with Christ, with celibacy, not going back to addiction. Because many things have happened. I could have easily went back to addiction.
Yeah. So 2 questions. What advice do you have for anybody that may be trying to help somebody out of a situation like what you went through? Somebody that may be being prostituted or trafficked, or may willingly be out on the street prostituting themselves.
The first thing I would say is don't give up on them just because they may have a time that they seem like they're really not serious about getting help. One of the things that I've learned is, especially with people who are in trafficking situations, when they reach out, or if they say they want help, they truly do, but then they fear. They fear the person that's holding them. They fear what it looks like not being in that lifestyle anymore. So sometimes that person, they're saying they want help, but their actions are looking like they really don't want help. Right. So for someone who is led to help them, I would say continue reaching out, continue letting them know you're there for them, to help them, until it gets to where they're just like, no, I don't want your help. Because some people really will just turn their backs and say, nah, I've decided I want this lifestyle. But if it's someone who continuously, you can look past their actions and see their pain. Right. You can see that this really wasn't their choice. This is really bondage. This is really something that they don't even know how they got into it some of the times. Don't give up on them just because they give up on themselves. Right. And just to briefly share, because we've had that situation, we had a 16-year-old girl reach out and she wanted help. And I would tell her, look, I'll help you, but I need you to let me know when, where, how. And on social media and stuff, it looked like this girl does not want help. She's, twerking. She don't want help. But the Lord just kept telling me, keep reaching out, keep reaching out, keep reaching out. Don't give up on her. Let her know, that you're here for her. And even though we didn't end up being the ones to help her get out, recently she reached out and said, I finally got out. And so she thanked me, because she said, I only got out because you were the one that didn't give up on me. Mm-hmm. And she said, I didn't call you to help me. She said, but I got a situation. She said, my pimp ended up getting arrested. And in that time of him being arrested, I checked myself into a substance abuse program. So she got out and got help. But she did let me know it was because no matter anybody else who was giving up on her, I would still message her. I would still call her. So just don't give up. No matter what it looks like, just don't give up on them.
And what advice would you give to a female, a girl, a lady in the same situation? Living on the streets, prostituting, being trafficked, feeling like there's no way out, there's no hope, there's nothing left. What advice would you give to her?
The first thing, I always have to point it back to Jesus, because if it was not for him, I would have never got out. It really was me learning that he was real and accepting that he was real. But even after that, I allowed myself to start working on myself. So what I would say is, go back to who you were before you became that person. Yes. And I tell victims, when we're helping mentoring people, I always tell them, don't look at who you are now. Go back to who you were before you touched the drug the first time. Yeah. Go back to who you were before you drank. Go back to who you were before you got into prostitution. That's who God created you to be. Right. What happened was the enemy came in and he did what he does. He steals, kills, and destroys. The minute that seed was planted and that door was open and you didn't know how to get out of it, you became that thing. But that's not who you really want to be. That's not who you want to become. Who you want to be is who you were before that bad thing happened. So I always encourage people, no matter how painful it looks, no matter how painful or tormenting the voices may be, because you will hear voices that'll tell you, you can't get out of this. You're not worth it. This is exactly what you deserve. This is what you became. You'll hear all kind of blame and shame and guilt and condemnation. But even the Bible says there's no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. So you have to remind yourself that even though this thing has happened to you, that's not who you are. That's not who God created you to be. That's not who He intends on you to be for the rest of your life. And you do have enough strength and power to get out of the situation. You just have to follow through with receiving the help that someone's willing to give you.
Well, thank you, and I do want you to mention the name of your organization really quick for everybody and how they can look you up and support you and follow you and everything like that.
Okay, it's Breathe Life Evangelistic Outreach. We are a nonprofit organization. You can look us up on breathelife.org, but you can also see us on the IRS website, Louisiana State Registry website. You can contact us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, any social media avenue. We use those avenues so that people can reach out when they need to. We do offer free counseling resources and things like that for people wanting mentorship and development and rehabilitation. And you can also contact us on our ministry phone, which is 225-200-0166. And if you want to personally look me up, because I am online as well, it's Nissa. You're not going to be able to spell my last name. It's Odanaka eBay. However, look up Nissa, Nissa, and you'll see the strange name on Facebook.
Here's what we will do. We will tag everything below in the description
Yes.
so you can find her organization in any way you would like. And we just want to thank you today for coming on here and sharing your story with us.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me share my story, and I hope it helps many.
Absolutely.